Here's to anyone who's ever looked up. The airheads. And the space cases.
Live long and prosper.
The flight fanatics. The armchair astronauts. And the casually curious. Here's to those who know the thrust in newtons of a Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet engine. And those who silently ask, what's keeping this thing in the air? Here's to those who can list the name, mission history, and favorite breakfast of every Mercury astronaut. And those who've ever searched for, how does a toilet work in space? Here's to the people who knew a P-38 Lightning from a P-51 Mustang. And the people who thought those were the names of cars. Those captivated by the miracle of flight. And those who are just happy to make their flight. So whatever captures your curiosity.
We choose to go to the moon.
Or propels you to new heights. When it comes to the sky, there's space for all of us.
Good evening and welcome to the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. I'm Chris Brown and have the privilege of serving as the John and Adrienne Mars Director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. Whether you are joining us here in person, here in the Airbus IMAX Theater, or tuning in from afar, thank you for taking the time to participate in our annual Amelia Earhart Lecture in Aviation History. This program is our premier aviation lecture held each spring, named in honor of Amelia Earhart. She was one of the most well-known aviators of all time, and her story has sparked worldwide interest in aviation since the 1920s. Today is actually the 93rd anniversary of Earhart completing her flight from Newfoundland, Canada, to Londonderry, North Ireland, to become the first woman to fly solo, nonstop, across the Atlantic. It is in honor of her legacy that we host our signature aviation lecture each year, inviting speakers from throughout aviation to share their impactful stories. In this year's lecture, U.S. Navy Commander Porter Halyburton will deliver a candid talk about his time while held captive as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. 60 years ago this fall, the McDonnell F-4B Phantom, the Commander Halyburton was flying over North Vietnam, was struck by anti-aircraft artillery, forcing him to eject. He spent the next 7 years and 4 months as a prisoner of war. For most of the time, he was held in the Hỏa Lò prison, infamously known as the Hanoi Hilton. Tonight, Halyburton will share his experience as a POW and discuss the community that formed amongst the hundreds of American pilots and aviators held at that prison. A community rooted in support for each other, and one that created bonds that lasted long past their release. Commander Halyburton has also written a book about his experience called Reflections on Captivity, a tapestry of stories by a Vietnam POW. After tonight's lecture, he will be signing copies of his book, so do stop by to purchase your own special edition. Before we get any further into the evening, I want to thank our friends at Pratt & Whitney and RTX Business, who have generously sponsored this aviation lecture series for many years. We appreciate their help as we continue to share aviation history with our audiences in person and online. Joining us in the audience this evening is Amy Comer, the Vice President of GTF Programs at Pratt & Whitney. Welcome, Amy, and please accept our collective thanks and appreciation. And with that, I'd like to turn over to our Aeronautics Curator, Dr. Michael Hankins, to introduce Commander Halyburton in more detail. Michael.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you. I appreciate that introduction. My name is Mike Hankins. I'm one of the curators here at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, and I just wanted to say a very brief word of introduction here. Because the Vietnam War, for many of us feels like a long time ago. Some of the people in this room were not alive when it happened. Maybe some of the people at this podium were not alive when it happened. But most of us in this room, if we were not there ourselves, there are some veterans here, we know someone, maybe our family members, loved ones, friends, that either participated in the war or were touched by it directly in some way. And even beyond that, in terms of its place in American history and how it has shaped our culture, our technology, the Vietnam War is still very much with us. We are very much living in the wake of that conflict. And aviation was a very key part of that war. All the military services of the United States used aircraft for almost any conceivable mission that you could think of an airplane doing: air-to-air combat, ground attack, transportation. If you can think of an airplane doing a mission, it probably did it in some way or form in the Vietnam War. Flying over North Vietnam specifically was a lot more dangerous. It was one of the most dangerous things you could do in an aircraft in Southeast Asia. What was happening there was those strategic bombing missions against key targets in North Vietnam. And the F-4 Phantom, aside from being one of the best looking planes ever, was one of the major workhorses of those efforts. It was the most, for the time, advanced, sophisticated aircraft in the American inventory. It was high-tech. It had incredibly advanced electronics and avionics systems and radar systems and new weapons, new types of missiles that made it really special. However, North Vietnam at the time also had one of the most advanced and deadly air defense networks that existed in the world at that time. Radar-guided missiles, guns, anti-aircraft artillery, enemy fighter jets, dense radar and communications networks. North Vietnam was a very dangerous place to fly. It was a very dense electronic battlefield that was very difficult for aircraft, to put it mildly. In fact, if you look just at fixed wings, so airplanes, not counting helicopters or drones or something like that, just airplanes, the United States lost over 3,300 fixed-wing aircraft during the entire war. Many of the air crews in those aircraft were killed. 3,288 American crew members died during that war. Many of those were rescued after they were shot down. Many did not survive. But almost 500 of them became prisoners of war inside of North Vietnam. And those POWs experienced very harsh treatment, up to and including torture. And we have one of those POWs with us today. Now, I want to give a little bit more detail. Chris gave a great overview of what happened to Commander Halyburton, but just to give a little insight here, and I'm sure he will give us even more, Commander Halyburton started off as a F-4 Phantom Radar Intercept Officer. He joined VF-84, the Jolly Rogers, in April of 1965, and the very next month started flying combat operations in Vietnam, flying off the USS Independence aircraft carrier. So he had flown 75 missions, and on his 76th, this was October 17th of 65, he was flying as part of a large strike force to destroy a bridge about 30 miles north of Hanoi. His pilot on that mission was Lieutenant Commander Stanley Olmstead. They were assigned the very dangerous role of flak suppression. And on the way to the target, they were hit by anti-aircraft artillery fire. Their Phantom went out of control, and Halyburton was forced to eject. Olmstead, unfortunately, did not survive, but Halyburton did. He was captured and, as Chris mentioned, went to the Hỏa Lò prison known as the Hanoi Hilton. He was a prisoner for 2,675 days. After his release in 1973, Halyburton stayed with the Navy and actually went on to teach at the Navy War College for quite some time. So he's also the author of Reflections on Captivity, a tapestry of stories by a Vietnam War POW, which you will be signing copies of afterwards, so please stick around. And please join me in welcoming Porter Halyburton.
Thank you, Michael and Chris and everybody here at the Air and Space Museum. You've been so welcoming and helpful here, and I'm honored to be here to give this important lecture about Amelia Earhart, who I've always wondered, well, whatever happened to her anyway? I don't think we know. And so I want to, first of all, recognize my wife of 62 years, Marty, who I would not be here without her guidance and her love and everything else. And so what I want to do is I want to go through a series of slides rather quickly to give you a background of some of the environment that we were in before I talk about how we reacted to that environment, because that's what's important about talking about an experience like this. It's not so much what happened, it's important what you did in reaction to it, the choices that you made in doing that. And so I want to go through these slides. Whoops. Help. Okay, you've seen the F4, you've seen the Independence, a map of Southeast Asia. I'm sure most of you are all familiar with that. And we were fighting north against south. We flew Dixie Station in the south and Yankee Station in the north, missions against Vietnam. And that you've seen this. This is my pilot, Stan Olmstead, who was killed. He was the finest pilot in our squadron. I wound up, after being shot down, in a small village in what we called the Hanoi Hilton, Hỏa Lò prison, built by the French during their colonial period. There are quite a few different areas there. That circled red one is one that we called Heartbreak Hotel. And this is my first accommodation here in the Hanoi Hilton in Heartbreak Hotel. You can see it's pretty sparse. And I was to go from here to many other places. I was in at least 5 other prisons other than the Hanoi Hilton. I want to introduce you to Mike McGrath, who was there for 6 years, a wonderful artist, and he drew scenes of life in our prison. And I have permission to show you a couple of those. This one I show you as punishment. This is just one example of punishment, which you could endure punishment. This one is torture. You could not endure this for long. So I'll show you those because I'll be talking about those two kinds of things later on. I spent time with a man named Fred Cherry, Air Force Major. I'll talk more about Fred as we go along, but Jim Hirsch wrote a book about our time together called Two Souls Indivisible. And so I'm going to talk about several events in Vietnam that had dramatic change on the way we were treated. And the Hanoi March was one of them. We bombed, this is in the summer of '66. At that time, there were almost exactly 100 POWs. and 50 of us marched through the streets of Hanoi, handcuffed together. It looks pretty peaceful right here, but it got way out of hand, and it was one of the very few times that I feared for my life because the crowd got out of hand. Anyway, this was a seminal event. So these are the three top leaders that I looked up to the most. Lieutenant Colonel Robbie Reisner, Air Force, flew in World War II. He was an ace in Korea. His picture appeared on the cover of Life magazine right before he was shot down. The Vietnamese said, aside from capturing McNamara, we're more overjoyed to get you than anybody else. And then James Bond Stockdale, who was a senior naval officer, and Jerry Denton, Commander Jerry Denton, who was in Stockdale's class at the Naval Academy. I'm sure you're all familiar with Jerry Denton blinking torture in a session. So these were the three senior leaders that really made a huge difference. I'll talk about communications as we go along, and this is the method, the basis of our communications network, the tap code. You tap the row number and then the column number, and you have a cell in that matrix which identifies a letter, and so then you can spell things. As simple as that. And so I didn't communicate with my family for 5 years. And after 5 years, I got in the mail this picture of Marty, my wife, and a daughter, Dabney, that I had not seen since she was 5 days old. And so this is another event that changed a lot for me. Well, not too many people have their own tombstone, but I do, and people ask about it, and I say, well, it's great to be able to look down on the damn thing rather than up, you know. So that's another story. And so I want to talk about things that, to me, are lasting and are important to our survival, and some things that are still very important to me in my everyday life today. And, you know, you've seen something about, and have heard of something about the way we were treated and things that were done to us, and the fact that we could not communicate with our families, we could not communicate with each other. We had very strict regulations that were expressed in what the Vietnamese called camp regulations. And so we are living in that environment, a very alien environment. We're trying to make adjustments. We're trying to figure out how to live in this situation. We are also living by the U.S. military code of conduct, which tells us how to behave, our responsibilities, and what to do and not to do. And so it's this environment that was quite difficult in the very beginning. And so I learned two very, very important lessons, and I want to talk about both of them. The first one occurred at the very beginning of my experience. The second one appeared at the very end, and so I'll talk about them in that order. And so I'm trying very hard to stick to the code of conduct, to not tell them anything except name, rank, service number, and date of birth. And after a couple of weeks of that, expending life in leg irons, you saw them in the cell that were built in, beatings and threats and all kinds of things to coerce POWs to talk. And finally, the Vietnamese said, if you continue to refuse to talk to us, we'll move you to a worse place. Well, you saw the place that I was in. I had never been in a place worse than that. I couldn't imagine a place worse than that. If you talk to us, we'll move you to a better place. Well, okay, that sounds good, but I'm not caving in. So I chose not to talk to them, and I moved to a worse place. This happened 3 more times. I wound up in a just horrible place. I was sick. It was a storage shed out by the back of a different prison that we call the zoo. It was filled with vermin, rats in and out. I couldn't eat the food. The food was left outside. I became sick. I was in isolation. Isolation is different than solitary confinement. Isolation means you cannot talk to anybody else. That does crazy things with your mind over time. I have a friend, a POW, who was tortured many times and spent a long time in isolation. And he said, given the choice, long-term isolation or torture, I'd take the torture. So it was that severe, and I was in this environment, and it was beginning to work crazy things. And yet, when I was presented with the same question, a better place, a worse place, it was the hardest decision I ever made. I couldn't see a good outcome from any of that. And so I said no. And I was blindfolded, moved up to another cell block. The door was open to a cell. I was pushed inside. I was told, you must care for Cherry. And Cherry was a black Air Force major, 105 pilot, and very, very badly injured, and I was told to care for him. They must have thought that putting a young Southern white boy in with a black and told to care for him would be the worst thing. Plus, he was Air Force. Of course, it was the best thing. It was the best thing, and I'll tell you why. It was because I had been concerned with very few things up until that point. 1 was survival, 2 was staying healthy, 3 was doing my duty, sticking to the code, doing the best that I could. That was about it. And now I had something very important to do that lay outside of my own concerns. I was given the responsibility, the task, to try and help this man survive. And so the Jim Hirsch book, Two Souls, goes into great detail about our time together. Fred and I were together for 8 months, and we became great friends. He said I saved his life, and he certainly saved me in the way that my attitude about captivity changed. I now realize that it was not going to be a short-term thing, that we had things to do, that we had to take care of each other, we had to respect each other, we had to understand each other, all of these things. And so my life was very different after Fred Cherry. I'll talk about that later. And so in this process is when I learned this first lesson. We all know this lesson. You all know that you have free will, that you can make choices about what to do and not to do. And those choices, the quality of those choices determines the quality of your life. But until this kind of thing is hammered into you in this way, it does not become a real thing. And so the realization that the Vietnamese, as you saw in the drawings by Mike, could take away every freedom that you had. You could not do anything except for one thing, and that's make a choice, how you are going to react to that circumstance. And so this lesson of your free will, of making choices, was one of the thing that got me personally and many others through this experience. If you read Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about that in detail. I had never read that, but in reading it after, I said, this explains everything. You know, you learn the most about life, about leading a meaningful life through suffering. And here we were suffering together. And so doing it together was so important. So that was the first really important lesson. So I want to now talk about what I would say were the important aspects of our captivity. And the first of them I've talked about a little bit was leadership. We were very, very fortunate in having the great leaders that we had. And it wasn't just Reisner and Stockdale and Denton and many others at the top level. It was at the middle level. It was at the bottom. We had a Navy enlisted E2 who was a great hero. That's a different story. I don't have time to tell you that. But there's a book, you know, the Unlikeliest Hero, about Doug Hedgel. And so leadership was such a key to our survival and our ability to resist, our ability to respond to what the Vietnamese were trying to do to us and with us, which essentially was propaganda, because they knew that they weren't going to win the war militarily. They were going to win the war by turning the American public opinion against the war to such an effect that we would have to give up and go home. Well, that's a short history of the war in a way. That's exactly what happened. And so this leadership was very critical. And there were leaders, our senior leaders were isolated from us as much as possible. The Vietnamese understood everything about this. And so we didn't have day-to-day contact with our senior leaders. What we did have contact was what we call the SRO, which was the senior guy that had communications with a group, a cell block, so on. So it was these leaders at the mid-level who were running things day by day, and we had outstanding leaders. I talk, in the book, I talk many stories about Air Force captain named Bob Percy, and they were running the show based on the guidance of our senior leadership. So the next thing that was so important was this communications. I showed you the basis of that communication, which was that TAP code, which goes back to ancient Greek times. It was used in World War II. It was immediately classified top secret once we got home, but never quite understood that. But anyway, we had many other ways of communicating, some of them based on this, some of them based on a deaf-mute code that we invented or came up with ourselves, many other methods of communicating, because communicating was the most important thing that we did. You think about leadership. Many of you here are top-level leaders who are concerned about your leadership of the people that you are over. Think about communications. If you cannot communicate with the people that you lead, you can't lead, period. The Vietnamese understood this. That's why they tried to keep us in isolation, because they knew that our senior leaders, Stockdale, Denton, Reisner, and others, were going to encourage us to resist. They were going to give us advice and orders and so on. Inspirational leadership. And so that's why they were isolated from us. And so that's just why this second level of leadership was so important. But communication was our lifeblood. Without it, we would have been in great trouble. And so this is something that you all know. You know this better than I do. But if you cannot communicate in your personal lives, in your family, in your organizations, in your religious institutions, in your corporations and companies and everything that you belong to, then it will not be what it should be. So communication was the thing that we had to do. We were the most professional at that of anything. I would say more and through this method of communication, the Vietnamese knew about that tap code. They tried to stop it. The punishment for using it and getting caught was very, very severe. And yet we did it anyway. They could break it down. They could nearly stop it. We always had ways of getting back into that net and reestablishing our network and so on. So the Vietnamese knew exactly what they were doing when they were telling us, you cannot make a noise outside of your cell. You cannot attempt to communicate with other prisoners and so on. So that was so important. With this communication system, we not only built a military organization, knowing the chain of command, knowing what our senior leaders had to say about various things, but we also built a community over time. You know, it didn't happen overnight, but over time, we built a community. And we had nearly every aspect of community except for our real families. Over time, I think we built a family. And one of the things that I did was and I'll talk about this a little later, is to memorize the names of everybody who was there. As they arrived, I was able to get them. I collected them. I put them in various lists: name, service, rank, airplane, date of shoot down, whatever else I knew. Memorized this. And in 1968, when the bombing stopped and we stopped getting POWs for a while, I had 350 names. I had to go over this list every single day to make sure that I didn't lose it and to make corrections when I came in contact with somebody else. So it was very important, our communication network, to be able to do things like that, to make sure nobody stayed outside the communications network, outside of our support group, because we never wanted to let anybody feel isolated and alone and despair, because that kills people over time. So the other thing that to me was so important was to remain active. I'd heard stories about other prisoners who sort of gave up out of despair and curled up in a fetal position and simply died from despair. And I knew, you just had to keep everything going. And so I made a vow I was going to stay as active as I possibly could, as the environment and the diet and all of that allowed, mentally, physically, and spiritually. And I think that allowed us to come back in pretty good shape. I worked out to, the extent of my ability. I learned so many different things. I had only done 20 push-ups, in pre-flight school. So I worked up to do 100 push-ups. My friend Irv Williams, we had a little contest. He was in the push-up contest. He did 2,225 push-ups. if you can imagine that. I can because I counted every one of them. I was in the deep knee bend contest. I worked up to it, but I did 6,000 deep knee bends without stopping, and I lost. I could tell you why I lost, but it was, we had things like that. I learned to walk on my hands. I could walk across this stage on my hands. I had a friend who could not only do a handstand and walk on his hands, he could do a vertical push-up. That means you're doing a handstand, you lower down, touch your nose, push back up. He could do 10 of those. Absolutely amazing. So it was just a question of your determination of what you were going to do mentally, physically, and spiritually. And spiritually, every Sunday, I was shot down on a Sunday, but the next Sunday, the senior guy who was in our heartbreak said, we're having a church call. And that meant if you weren't in leg irons, you could stand up and you said the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. You said, if you were a Christian, you said the Lord's Prayer, and then you had your own religious service. That happened every Sunday. The senior ranking officer called church call. And over time, church services became quite elaborate. Of course, I started writing poetry in high school, and I majored in English in college. And so I had that background, which is a little different from a lot of the aeronautical engineers who were there. Gave me a leg up in a way. So I started writing poetry and eventually writing songs and so on. So it was this kind of activity that kept us mentally sharp. And we were trying to learn languages. I learned German while I was there. There was no textbooks, nothing to write down or anything. But I learned enough German. When I came back, I wanted to go to grad school, and so I asked my advisor, I said, I'd like to take a couple of undergraduate courses. I told him I'd like to take German. He said, well, what's your background? And I told him. He said, why don't you take the equivalency test? So I did. I passed first-year college German based on what I'd learned in Hanoi University. So there was some serious activity that went on academically, and we told movies. It was just, it was amazing over time as our groups got bigger, what we were able to accomplish in that way. There were changes, I've mentioned, there were changes in our environment. There were changes in things that happened that changed things for me personally and things that changed for our whole environment. The first one, I think, was when I moved in with Fred Cherry and was given this responsibility to care for him. That was a life-changing thing. Fred Cherry and I became lifelong friends up until he died in 2016. At the age of 87, he was one incredible human being, and I was so privileged to be able to help him to survive. I showed the Hanoi March, and that was a result of our bombing POL storage inside of Hanoi. And that really got their attention, and they decided to take it out on us and make a display. They threatened to put us on trial for war crimes and to execute us. President Johnson said they made this threat, worldwide in parading us through the streets of Hanoi. We nearly died there because the crowd got out of hand. And Johnson said, you know, if you do that, I'm sending the B-52s to level Hanoi. So they didn't put us on trial, but the policy towards us changed dramatically. Prior to that, we'd had lots of punishment, harsh conditions, but torture was only used sporadically for punishment. But now it was going to be used to extract the information and the written documents that they had been unable to get without torture. So this was an entirely different environment, dealing with the reality of torture and how do you continue to remain true to the spirit of the code of conduct, to the idea that you're never going to give them anything useful against our country or our families or anything. And so this was a very, very difficult period of time, but one in which we learned more about ourselves during this process of how do you deal with not only being tortured, but being broken. And dealing with the fact that you were broken was something that was very difficult. So that ushered in a period of 4 years in which it was pretty tough times. But finally, the Vietnamese realized that the way they were treating us, the word got out about torture, the public opinion turned against them for that. They realized that, and so Ho Chi Minh died in late '69, and so they took that opportunity to change our treatment, and they quit torturing us. They gave us better food. That's when I got letters from Marty. We began to correspond, get packages, and so on. Things got a lot better. In the middle of that, though, we had the Sante raid, attempt to rescue a prison. There was nobody there. They had been moved out, but it gave us a huge morale boost that our country was willing to come and try and get us out. And so that was another big change. Well, the other thing for me personally was the knowledge that I had been dead. I found out a year and a half after I'd been there that I had been declared killed in action. A guy off my ship had come in and he said, "Oh, by the way, I'm glad to see you're here, but you've been dead." Well, you can imagine, because uncertainty is one of the hardest things to deal with. If you know something for a fact, then you can deal with it. If there's uncertainty, it's much more difficult. So you can imagine on Marty's part, because she found out that I was alive about the same time I found out I was dead. So we both had to deal with our own uncertainty. Yeah. The different environments that I was in a solitary confinement. I was in isolation, solitary confinement. I lived with one other guy for years, not the same guy, Fred Cherry and others. And then I moved in with this group of 9 of us. That was a miraculous change, to have 9 people that you could talk to, that you could learn from, that gave you a sort of a sense of strength in numbers rather than just being alone in that. And so, and then eventually, towards the end, there were groups of 20 to 40, which again changed the environment of our captivity. So there were those changes that made such a difference. The last lesson that I learned, it was towards the very end when we knew we were going home. We were talking about how it was going to, what we were going to do. I was looking at that picture of Marty and Dabney. That was what I was so concerned about, getting home to them. I overheard two guys talking about revenge, how they were going to get back at the Vietnamese for everything that had been done to us and our families and everything else. I suddenly realized that hatred was such a powerful force, and it had been useful. Hatred built armor, a shield, against what our captors were trying to do with us. There was nothing they could tell us that would break through this armor of hatred. And so it was a good thing. It was our weapon. But I suddenly realized, once I heard these guys talking about revenge, that I couldn't take that hatred home. That was too much. And if I did, the Vietnamese, these people would still control my life in a way. And I had already said they are never going to adversely affect my life again. And so when I walked through the gates of the Hanoi Hilton, what I thought was the last time, I just turned around to that building as a symbol of everything that had been done to us. And I said, I forgive you. All of that armor fell away. All of that hatred went away. It went away out of my life. I do not have hatred in my life. It's the most liberating thing that I have ever done in my life. And I came to realize that these two lessons, making a choice and forgiveness, came together because you have to make a choice to forgive. So these came together, and I walked out of two prisons that day, the Hanoi Hilton and the prison of hatred. There are many other prisons that we wind up in, addictions and all kinds of things like that. But if you realize the power of making a choice, choosing your attitude, you have the keys to those prisons. And to me, that is a wonderful revelation. You know, we have the power to change our lives if we have the will to do so. Do I have enough time to read a poem? I wrote a lot of poems while I was in jail, and this one, the Reflections on Captivity, is where the name of this book and this lecture comes from. So let me read that. How can I measure the loss of my dimensions as I lie spread across this crass expanse of time? Bitter years devoid of latitude or luster, my duty days of trial and decision are but pages turned, but pages not forgotten. Those countless hours of aimless retrospection, regret, and introspection, the strange monotony of unrewarded hopes, unconquered hopes, amidst my unborn tears, have tempered the metal of my structure and filled the empty spaces of my soul. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, we've got a few minutes left for questions, so we're going to sit down real quick. For those of you in the room, I believe we have a QR code you can scan to ask a question. If you're watching online, feel free to drop a question in the comments there, and I will see those here, and we can ask a bunch of questions. And thank you so much for that wonderful talk. And just as we move into some questions here, I just have to say it's difficult, to say the least, for most of us here to imagine what you're describing and what you're going through. And it's difficult to ask questions about this type of thing. So I appreciate you offering us your answers to our questions here. There's several great questions coming in, so please, those watching and those here, please keep them coming. I'll start with this one. Was there any such thing as a typical day that you could describe while you were?
Well, I guess at these various times when I was living alone or with one other, you could say there was a typical day. We had 2 meals a day, and surprisingly, the Vietnamese let us smoke cigarettes, 3 cigarettes a day. I think it was because Ho Chi Minh had been in jail, and he smoked. So I'm guessing, but so we had 3 cigarettes and 2 meals. You might go to interrogation. You might go out and wash the dishes. You might take a sponge bath or something like that. That's about it. That's about it for that kind of environment. But later on, we were bigger groups. Of course, we had much more activity. We had period for physical exercise. We had somebody would tell a movie in the evening. We even made playing cards out of toilet paper. And I was the only one in this group that could play bridge, and so I taught these guys how to play bridge, and we played a rudimentary form of bridge. And I will tell one story. The Vietnamese found the cards and tore them up, put us in leg irons, and stormed out of the room, taking most everything we had, and said, you are forbidden to play bridge or cards. And we took that as a sort of slap across the face. And so they walked out, and we're in leg irons here, and we decided, let's play bridge without the cards. And we did. All memory, yeah. It was a challenge that we rose to, yeah.
Will remind me never to play cards again. So this is another great question. You went back to Vietnam after the war. How did you feel when you first went back? Were you able to connect with anyone there?
Well, I didn't want to go back. I wanted to go to Paris and London, and all these other places. Why would I want to go back to Vietnam? But in the end, in 1968, there was a trip that was organized for former POWs, and I was shot down on October the 17th. This trip was leaving on October the 17th. The trip, I arrived in Hanoi the first time on October the 19th. This trip was arriving in Hanoi on October. Seemed like a sign to me. And Marty was going to go without me, so I decided to go. So, and it was really not, I tried to find the crash site where Stan died. But aside from that, it was really just to see the place, I'd seen a lot of it from the air and from the inside of some buildings, but nothing else. And so it was really as a tourist. And we were absolutely amazed at the reception that we had from the Vietnamese people, North Vietnamese people. They, U.S. #1. Amazing.
Wow. Well, kind of a similar question, but further back in time, when you were there the first time, did you meet any Vietnamese people or soldiers that showed you compassion or were nice to you while you were a prisoner?
I've been asked that question a lot. I've thought about it. I can only think of 2 instances. I'll only tell you about one. And that was, I was caring for Fred Cherry. He's in he's in this cast with his arm out like this, and I could give him a sponge bath. I could do lots of things for him, but his fingernails got really long and dirty and all that. I could take care of mine by chewing them off or rubbing them on this concrete. The one thing I was not going to do for Fred was chew off his fingernails. So we had this turnkey, and I pointed at him, and I said, can you do, and damn if he didn't go get some clippers and allowed me to cut Fred's fingernails, toenails, and all of that.
Wow.
That's about it.
Well, again, please keep these questions. There's a lot of really good questions coming in here, so please keep them coming. What got you into writing poetry, and what related to that is the greatest challenge, you would say, of the writing of your work?
Well, I was in the 11th grade. I had this absolutely amazing English teacher named Bill Goldfinch, and he was unlike any other 11th grade teacher. And he so inspired us to do so many things. And we were talking about Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas had recently died from alcoholism and everything. And I was touched by that. And I wrote a poem on the death of Dylan Thomas. And he thought it was good enough, and he encouraged me. And so I enjoyed doing it, and I continued to write poetry through high school and college, and so I was, it was something to do, while I was there. Most of them to try and explain how I felt about our circumstances, like, reflections on Captivity.
Yeah. There's a great question here about communication, kind of related, is how often were you physically in the same space with the other prisoners or cells next to each other? Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about how that communication worked?
Well, if you were, you're in one cell and somebody else is in another cell, the way you communicated was tapping on the wall. And so that was like, a two-way conversation, a phone conversation. And when you wanted to talk, you used a very American thing to make the phone ring. And the answer, of course, was 2 bits. And so that's how you started the conversation. And if there was a guard coming or something, you use your elbow to thump against the wall, saying, danger, assume an innocent position. And so then whatever message you were passing to the senior officer, maybe went from that wall to another wall to another wall, and maybe from there, from that building to another building. And you would use the same numbers 1 to 5. If you could take a piece of straw or paper and you could stick it out under your door and you knew somebody else was watching it in another cell, you could, stick it in and out in a rhythm, numbers, send code. That's how we did that. And then finally, we realized any way you could send numbers, either visually or audio, you could send this code. And so we did that. And I mentioned we had a deaf-mute code that we could use as well. So it all depended on the environment, what kind of group you were in. Towards the end, we were groups of 40. We had daily communications where we were communicating vast amounts of information, educational materials, and all kinds of things, yeah.
And did the North Vietnamese break the code? Did they understand what was going on?
They knew the tap code. They knew it when they heard it. They would sometimes listen on the wall to see if you were doing that. Sometimes come in and tap on the wall. That's why this shaving a haircut was so important. Because if you didn't hear shaving a haircut, you didn't respond. Yeah. They could damage our network, but they never broke it entirely. Yeah.
There's several interesting questions coming in about how you were able to reintegrate kind of into normal life, and I want to ask you this question in particular, coming from and thank you for whoever wrote this question. As a veteran who struggles with PTSD and depression daily, how have you coped and continued to cope through your life after release?
I don't really think that I had PTSD. I think we had processed so much of our experience beforehand, and we had shared so much that I think it was therapeutic. And when we came back, the problem was to catch up. We had gotten virtually no news except stuff about the bad things that were going on in the war. And so there was so much that we needed to catch up with. And the Navy particularly, was very good about that. And Reader's Digest even published a special edition called While You Were Gone, about the major events that had happened while we were gone. But I'll tell you one story that we heard about the assassination of JFK and Martin Luther King within hours of the occurrence.
Wow.
We found out about landing on the moon through a slip-up in their propaganda broadcast that said it doesn't take a Neil Armstrong looking from the face of the moon to tell that the U.S. is losing the war in Vietnam. They went, Neil Armstrong, okay. And then some very clever wife in a package that we got later had scooped up a handful of sugar packs that on the backside had shots of the moon landing. Threw them in the package, and the Vietnamese never looked at them. So we got that too, yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. Here's a question. You were kind of telling me about some of this before we were started this evening, but I'll ask this. Do you ever get to reunite with your fellow captives?
Yes, I think we did that. We had what we call a listserv, meaning you could go up and put up messages that everybody would see, respond to, and so on. And that worked for quite a few years until the guy that ran the thing died and left the passcode. so our listserv died. But yes, we've had reunions. We had big reunions every 2 years, sometimes smaller reunions every year. So yeah, we stay in touch. And I got a notification from Mike McGrath, who drew the pictures for it. He's our historian, and he said, right now there were 664 POWs. He said 332 are still alive, meaning 332 have died. So about half of us are still alive. And we get notifications of things, but it's not the same kind of back and forth, yeah.
I'm not sure how we're doing on time. I think we have time for a couple more. I want to ask you one. This comes from me. How is it like flying the F-4 Phantom? What do you think of that airplane?
At the time, I thought the F-4 was the most exciting airplane, ever been built, aside from the 104, which didn't do much except really go fast, But anyway, the F-4 I thought was just the most. He was angry looking and it was just mean looking. I loved that airplane, and I got to fly in VF 101, the RAG. I got to actually fly a Model A, which had controls in the back seat, at Mach 2. So holding the stick of that airplane going Mach 2 was the thrill of my life, yeah.
Unbelievable. So this is the last question, and there, again, are several questions that are kind of getting at this idea, and I think this one sums it up, about the kind of meaning that you found through this experience. So this question asker asks, Do you feel that your experience in captivity made you a stronger person when you returned? What kind of meaning did you think you took away from this experience?
Well, I do. I really think that. And I read Viktor Frankl after that, and he talked about man's search for meaning as being the most basic urge that human beings have, to lead a meaningful life, to discover the meaning of one's life on an everyday basis. It's not talking about the big meaning of life, but personally, meaning in life for you. And so I think that I have found that. I search for it every day. Am I leading the kind of life that I think is meaningful, that's helpful to others, that kind of thing. So yes, I am motivated by that, and I am so grateful for my experience, because I'm not sure I would have learned that in any other way. Yeah.
Well, I think all of us are very grateful for the experience of being able to listen to you tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, yes. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank Pratt & Whitney and RTX Business so much for their continued support of this lecture and the many other lectures that they support for us here. Please stick around if you would like, because we are doing that book signing on the mezzanine out by the bookstore, so stick around for that. And thank all of you so much for joining us tonight. You make all these things possible. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
All right.